On 17 September 1940, Winston Churchill sat alone in the cabinet war rooms. The air thick with smoke and fatigue, listening to a report that would change Britain's fate. The Prime Minister, shoulders heavy beneath history, read the intelligence slowly, knowing millions waited beyond those walls, knowing the Channel had become a shield. Germany, bruised in the skies after months of battle, had lost the air superiority required for invasion, and the threat of Sea Lion was fading. For Churchill, this was not triumph but reprieve, a narrow pause between storms, measured against cities burning and graves still fresh. Only weeks earlier, London reeled beneath nightly bombardment. Civilians slept in tunnels and stations, and Britain's future seemed to flicker. Now the message before him whispered something unthinkable: that Hitler's armies could not cross the Channel, that the island still stood. Churchill leaned back, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights, and thought not of victory parades, but of survival hard-earned. Across Europe, dictators and democracies alike held their breath, because Britain's resistance anchored hope, and its fall would have sealed darkness. This knowledge carried weight beyond strategy, touching every factory floor and farmhouse, every sailor watching gray seas, every pilot counting fuel. Yet Churchill understood the truth beneath the relief, that Germany's failure to invade did not mean peace, it meant a longer war. He would later tell colleagues, in words stripped of celebration, that Britain had survived the first test, and the world was watching. The moment marked a turning of the tide, not in battles won but in war preserved, as the empire gathered itself for years ahead. Outside the bunker, London carried on under scarred skies. Buses rolled past rubble and posters, and ordinary life refused surrender. As night fell on that September day, Churchill prepared his next moves quietly, aware that history had blinked first, but had not ended. The words he spoke upon learning invasion was impossible would ripple far beyond Britain, shaping resolve in Washington and fear in Berlin. To understand what Churchill truly said, and why it mattered so deeply, we must step inside that room and follow the path ahead. On 20 September 1940, Churchill stood before his war cabinet, voice low but firm, choosing restraint over celebration, knowing hubris could undo them. He told them plainly that Germany's inability to invade was not defeat. It was delay, and delays in war could be as deadly as defeat. Around the table, generals and ministers absorbed the meaning. Britain still stood alone, but alone no longer meant helpless. Churchill spoke of pilots first, of young men who had burned through the summer skies, trading youth for time, buying survival hour by hour. He reminded them that the Luftwaffe still prowled, that bombs still fell, and that the enemy had not abandoned his hatred. Yet beneath the caution, there was iron certainty. Britain had passed through fire and emerged unbroken, and that fact could not be reversed. Churchill understood symbols deeply, and the failure of invasion shattered Hitler's aura of inevitability across occupied Europe. In cafes from Paris to Prague, whispered rumors spread: Britain had held. The Nazis could be stopped, the giant had stumbled. That afternoon, Churchill drafted a message for President Roosevelt, careful and deliberate, explaining the shift without exaggeration. He wrote that the island remained secure for now, that German barges lay idle, and that the skies told the real story. Across the Atlantic, those words landed heavily, shaping American calculations, nudging a reluctant nation closer to involvement. Back in London, Churchill walked through damaged streets later that evening, escorted quietly, greeted by nods not cheers. He understood morale was a weapon, but honesty was sharper. And Britain's people deserved truth rather than illusion. The enemy could not invade, but he could starve, bomb, and encircle. And the coming years would test endurance further. As night settled, searchlights cut through clouds, and the war pressed on, unchanged in cruelty but altered in balance. Churchill returned to his desk knowing one fact above all others: Britain's survival had become the hinge of world history. The words he chose in private carried weight far beyond that room, because resolve once proven cannot be unproven. By 1 October 1940. Churchill felt the shift in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, as reports confirmed German invasion preparations were dissolving. Captured reconnaissance showed barges rotting in French ports. Crews reassigned, confidence drained by defeat above the Channel skies. Churchill absorbed this not with relief, but with sharpened focus. Because a wounded enemy often struck harder elsewhere. He warned his chiefs that Hitler would redirect fury eastward or downward. Toward cities, toward shipping lanes, toward civilians. The Blitz intensified. Nights grew longer, flames rose higher. And Britain paid for survival in blood and brick. Churchill addressed Parliament soon after, measured and grave, refusing to declare a turning point while bodies were still being pulled from rubble. He spoke of endurance rather than victory, of time gained rather than danger past, knowing rhetoric must match reality. Privately, he confided to aides that the invasion threat dying meant Britain could now breathe, but never rest. Factories expanded output, shipyards worked around the clock, and the island transformed from besieged victim into armed fortress. Every convoy that sailed, every Spitfire repaired, carried the invisible weight of that failed invasion. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements took courage from Britain's stand, drawing strength from the simple fact of survival. Churchill received intelligence from neutral embassies, confirming German frustration, plans shifting, tempers flaring within Nazi command. He understood that Hitler's humiliation would demand compensation elsewhere, and that meant the war would widen. Still, this moment mattered deeply, because for the first time since 1 September 1939, Nazi expansion had been halted. Churchill wrote in his notes that evening that history had offered Britain a chance, and chances once missed rarely returned. The Channel, once a possible grave, had become a barrier of defiance, guarded by resolve as much as steel. As autumn deepened, Britain stood battered but alive, its future no longer decided by invasion timetables. What Churchill said next, to the nation itself, would shape how millions understood survival, sacrifice, and the road ahead. On 12 October 1940, Churchill prepared to speak to the nation, fully aware that words could steady nerves as much as guns. He reviewed casualty figures in silence, knowing every statistic hit a face, a family, a street erased overnight. When he spoke, his tone was grave and deliberate, avoiding triumph, choosing endurance as the message Britain needed. Churchill told the public that invasion had not come, but war remained, and false relief would be more dangerous than fear. He spoke of the Channel not as a miracle, but as a responsibility, one that demanded vigilance, labor, and unity. Across radios and bomb shelters and kitchens, people listened, clinging to the steadiness of his voice. Churchill framed the failed invasion as proof that resolve mattered, that discipline in the skies had altered destiny. He avoided naming Hitler directly, stripping the enemy of myth, reducing him to a man capable of error. Behind the scenes, military planners adjusted strategies, redirecting resources toward air defense and Atlantic shipping. The Royal Navy tightened its grip on the seas, knowing the threat had shifted, not vanished. Churchill confided later that this moment marked Britain's psychological survival, even more than its physical defense. Children were evacuated, rationing deepened, and life adapted to a war that now promised longevity. Abroad, diplomats reported shifting tones. Germany's unstoppable image had cracked, and cracks invite pressure. Churchill understood that Britain had become a symbol, and symbols carry burdens heavier than armies. As autumn rains fell, London smoldered and rebuilt simultaneously, destruction and defiance sharing the streets. The Prime Minister returned nightly to his bunker, aware that leadership meant absorbing fear so others could stand. He knew the world's balance now rested on Britain holding, not weeks, but years. The invasion that never came had changed everything, without ending anything at all. By 15 November 1940, Churchill felt the war settling into a harsher rhythm. Invasion gone, attrition fully arrived. The Blitz reached a savage peak, Coventry burned, and Britain learned that survival carried its own brutal cost. Churchill toured bombed cities quietly, stepping through ruins with measured silence. Understanding presence mattered more than speeches. He spoke with survivors whose homes were ash, whose losses were fresh, and whose resolve still held. Privately, Churchill reflected that Germany's failure to invade had not spared civilians. It had condemned them to endurance. Air raid reports crossed his desk nightly, marking patterns of destruction rather than fronts advancing. He told his staff that Hitler now sought to break morale, since he could not break the island itself. Factories moved underground, production surged, and Britain adapted with grim efficiency. Churchill addressed military leaders, stressing that time was now Britain's ally, a weapon earned in the skies months earlier. He emphasized convoy protection, Atlantic lifelines, and the slow strangulation of German resources. Across the empire, reinforcements gathered, encouraged by the simple truth that Britain still stood uninvaded. Churchill wrote again to Roosevelt, describing the enemy's frustration, urging aid not as charity, but as shared fate. In Berlin, intelligence reports acknowledged Britain's resilience, frustration simmering within Nazi command. The failed invasion haunted German planners, a missed moment that could not be recovered. Churchill understood history's cruelty. That one lost opportunity could reshape empires. As winter approached, Britain braced for cold nights and continued bombs. But no boots on its shores. The Channel remained silent, empty of enemy barges, loud only with memory. Churchill knew the invasion that never came had bound Britain's future to the wider war. On 10 January 1941, Churchill studied winter reports by lamplight, aware that survival now depended on endurance rather than sudden drama. Britain faced cold homes, thin rations, and relentless raids. Yet the absence of invasion reshaped every strategic calculation. Churchill reminded his chiefs that Germany's failure had bought time, and time demanded to be spent wisely. He spoke often of the Atlantic, of lifelines stretching thousands of miles, vulnerable yet essential. German U-boats now replaced invasion barges, stalking shipping with quiet menace beneath gray seas. Churchill understood this shift clearly. Britain was no longer fighting for beaches, but for supply. He ordered increased escort production, radar expansion, and deeper coordination with Canadian and American forces. Privately, he reflected that the Battle of Britain had merely changed the battlefield, not the enemy's intent. Air raid sirens still wailed, cities still burned, but the island's core remained intact. Churchill visited naval officers in Scapa Flow, speaking bluntly about losses and the cost of mistakes. He told them that Britain's fate floated on cold water, carried by convoys and courage. Across occupied Europe, resistance leaders listened closely to BBC broadcasts, drawing hope from Britain's persistence. Churchill knew symbols mattered, and Britain standing unconquered sent a message louder than any speech. In Berlin, frustration hardened into long-term planning. As Hitler turned attention eastward, Churchill read intelligence suggesting a future clash beyond Britain, one that could dwarf all previous battles. He grasped the implication immediately. Germany's failure to invade Britain would push the war wider, deadlier. This knowledge carried no comfort, only grim acceptance of what survival demanded next. As snow fell across London ruins, Churchill prepared Britain for a war no longer about invasion, but inevitability. The words he spoke in private now turned toward the future. Beyond Britain, toward a world soon to ignite further. By 22 June 1941, Churchill awoke to intelligence that confirmed what he had long suspected. Germany had turned east. Operation Barbarossa shattered the silence, as millions of soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union, opening a front of unimaginable scale. Churchill read the reports carefully, aware that Britain's survival the year before had made this moment possible. He understood instantly that Germany's failure to invade Britain had forced Hitler into this gamble. Churchill spoke to aides with clarity, stating that history had pivoted because Britain had held the line alone. Though ideologically opposed to communism, he knew this invasion changed everything. That evening, Churchill addressed the nation by radio, choosing words that balanced realism with necessity. He declared support for the Soviet Union, not out of sympathy, but out of shared survival. The speech stunned many, yet Churchill framed it simply. Any enemy of Nazi tyranny would receive Britain's aid. Privately, he reflected that the Channel defense in 1940 now echoed across the plains of Russia. Britain was no longer the lone target, and the war's center of gravity had shifted. Churchill informed Roosevelt that Hitler had overreached, opening a wound that might never close. American observers listened closely, calculating what Britain's endurance had enabled. Factories in Britain increased output again, now feeding a global war rather than a national defense. Churchill told Parliament that patience had been rewarded, though the cost was still rising. He knew the Eastern Front would bleed Germany, but also consume millions of lives. The invasion that never came to Britain had redirected catastrophe elsewhere. Churchill carried that burden quietly, aware that survival sometimes meant others would suffer more. As summer advanced, Britain stood no longer as a cornered island, but as a pillar of an emerging alliance. Churchill looked back on the moment he learned Germany could not invade, and understood its true meaning only now. It had not ended Britain's war. It had preserved Britain for history's next act. On 7 December 1941, Churchill was dining at Chequers, weary but composed, when the message from across the Atlantic arrived. Japan had struck Pearl Harbor, and in that instant, the war Churchill had carried almost alone transformed forever. He read the cable slowly, understanding immediately that Britain's survival in 1940 had made this alliance possible. Churchill later wrote that he slept the sleep of the saved, not from relief, but from certainty. Germany's failure to invade Britain had preserved the bridge between continents, now alive with consequence. Within days, Hitler declared war on the United States, sealing the global conflict Britain had long endured. Churchill traveled to Washington soon after, meeting Roosevelt as an equal, not a refugee. He spoke openly of the Channel defense, explaining how Britain had stood when standing seemed impossible. American planners listened intently, recognizing that without Britain's resistance, there would have been no Western foothold. Churchill framed the failed invasion not as luck, but as preparation for this moment. Factories roared on both sides of the Atlantic, synchronized by shared purpose. The Atlantic, once a lonely lifeline, became a highway of alliance. Churchill addressed Congress, his words shaped by years of isolation and resolve. He reminded them that tyranny thrives on the belief that resistance will collapse. Britain's endurance had disproved that belief at terrible cost. Privately, Churchill reflected on that September day when invasion faded, realizing it had been the hinge of the century. What once felt like survival alone, now revealed itself as foundation. The war had grown vast, mechanized, and merciless. But Britain was no longer alone. Churchill prepared for conferences, campaigns, and compromises, carrying forward the lesson learned when the barges stayed silent. The invasion that never came had preserved not just an island, but a path forward. By 4 June 1944, Churchill stood once more beside maps of the Channel, aware that history was returning to the same waters. This time the threat moved outward, not inward, as Allied armies prepared to cross toward occupied Europe. Churchill traced the coastline with a finger, remembering when those same shores once promised invasion and extinction. He spoke quietly to his generals, noting that Germany's failure in 1940 had made this moment possible. The island that could not be taken had become the launching ground for liberation. Churchill reflected on the long road, bombed cities, lost convoys, and years when Britain stood nearly alone. Now the Channel filled with ships by the thousands, carrying men who trusted the sky to remain friendly. He remembered the pilots, many long gone, whose sacrifice had kept those skies British. Churchill addressed the nation before D-Day, voice steady, heavy with the weight of memory and consequence. He did not speak of revenge, but of duty fulfilled after patience and pain. Privately, he admitted that watching others invade Europe stirred complex emotion, pride mixed with grief. The Germans who once planned to cross into Kent now waited behind concrete and wire. Churchill understood irony well. History had reversed the current of fate. He told aides that Hitler's first great failure had been underestimating Britain's refusal to yield. Across the beaches of Normandy, that refusal would soon arrive with force. As dawn approached on 6 June 1944, Churchill barely slept, listening for reports. Knowing the cost would be immense. The invasion that once threatened Britain now became the instrument of Europe's release. Churchill thought of the moment he learned Germany could not invade, realizing its echo had traveled 4 hard years. That knowledge had shaped alliances, strategy, and survival itself. The Channel, once a barrier, now became a bridge built from endurance. Churchill waited, cigar unlit, aware that the final judgment of that long-ago failure was still unfolding. On 8 May 1945, Churchill stood in London as church bells rang freely again. The war in Europe finally ended. Crowds filled the streets below. Faces lifted, voices hoarse with relief. Yet Churchill's expression remained complex and restrained. Victory had come, but it arrived carrying ghosts. Echoes of nights when invasion seemed inevitable. In private moments that day, Churchill returned in memory to 17 September 1940, when he learned Germany could not invade. He understood now what that knowledge truly meant. Not safety, but survival long enough for history to turn. Churchill spoke to aides about fate and choice, about how narrow margins decide centuries. He said that Britain's refusal to fall had altered the geometry of the war, bending events toward this moment. The words he had spoken then, careful and unsentimental, had been truer than anyone realized. Germany's failure to cross the Channel had forced delays, miscalculations, and overreach. Those delays had opened space for alliances, industry, and overwhelming force. Churchill acknowledged openly that Britain had paid dearly. Cities broken, families scarred, generations changed. Yet he believed that endurance itself had been Britain's greatest weapon. Standing before Parliament later, he framed victory not as destiny, but as consequence. He reminded them that nothing had been inevitable, least of all survival. The invasion that never came had demanded years of sacrifice afterward. Churchill said quietly that history often turns on what fails to happen, as much as what does. Germany's armies never landed on British shores, and because of that, they eventually surrendered everywhere else. As celebrations continued, Churchill withdrew from the noise, preferring reflection to applause. He knew his time in power was nearing its end, but the lesson would remain. Nations endure not through certainty, but through resolve when certainty is gone. The Channel lay calm again, unchanged in appearance, forever changed in meaning. And what Churchill said when he learned Germany could no longer invade was not a cry of triumph. It was a recognition that Britain had been granted time. And time, when used well, can decide the world.
1944. This is where we